He was the face of an era, fists of iron, a mohawk like a war flag, and the nickname the Iceman. Chuck Liddell didn't just knock people out, he ended careers. But now, that same warrior struggles to finish a sentence. His speech is slow, his thoughts repeat, and fans everywhere are starting to panic. After years of brutal knockouts, devastating losses, and a comeback that never should have happened, something has clearly changed. This is the full story of how Chuck Liddell's legendary mind began to slip, and why the people who once cheered for him now watch in silence, wondering if it's already too late. Before the worry, before the slurred speech, before the comeback that broke fans' hearts, Chuck Liddell was untouchable, a force of nature with a shaved mohawk, steel in his fists, and ice in his veins. They called him the Iceman, not because he was calm under pressure, but because pressure itself melted around him. From the first time he stepped into the octagon in 1998, Chuck didn't fight like other men. He fought like a myth in motion. Liddell's style was chaos-controlled. While others grappled for position, he stood tall and swung with intent to destroy. His takedown defense was ironclad, his chin uncrackable, and his right hand was a nuclear weapon with its own zip code. By the early 2000s, Chuck had fought and beaten the best. He ran through legends like Vitor Belfort, Alistair Overeem, Kevin Randleman, and Renato Sobral. Each time he walked to the cage, the crowd didn't just cheer, they roared like they were witnessing an execution. But it wasn't just his fighting that made him a star, it was the image. He looked like a street fighter ripped from a movie. Tattoos across his shoulders, shorts low on the hips, no flair, no flash, just war. UFC was still climbing toward the mainstream, and Chuck Liddell was the wrecking ball kicking the doors open. Dana White knew what he had, a killer who smiled on weigh-in day and didn't talk trash unless it was necessary. When Chuck knocked out Randy Couture in 2005 to win the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship, it was a coronation. The pay-per-view numbers exploded. Spike TV turned him into a weekly television star on The Ultimate Fighter. Casual fans knew the name, hardcore fans knew the stats. All of it building silently. No one talked about CTE, no one warned fighters that the same chin that made you famous might one day fail and never come back. Chuck kept marching. The snowball was still climbing the hill, but the cracks in the ice, they were already forming, and when it started to crumble, it didn't stop. In 2007, Chuck Liddell walked into the octagon as the undisputed king, but the aura was different. Slower footwork, fewer counterpunches. That uncanny ability to see punches before they landed was starting to fade. It was subtle, almost invisible, but for the trained eye, and for Chuck himself, it was there. Then came the fight with Quinton Rampage Jackson at UFC 71, a rematch years in the making. The first time they met in Japan, Jackson had overwhelmed him. This time, Chuck was the favorite. He was the champ. He was the Iceman. He got knocked out cold in less than 2 minutes. It was shocking, not just because Chuck lost, but because of how he lost. One punch, straight to the jaw, and he crumpled, limp. The crowd gasped. Jackson roared, and Chuck laid still. For the first time, fans saw what they never thought possible. Chuck Liddell flat on his back, eyes blank. The myth had cracked, and it got worse. In the very next fight, Chuck took on Keith Jardine, a solid contender, but not elite. Chuck lost again, not by knockout this time, but by decision. A slow, awkward battle where Liddell looked stiff and hesitant. The speed was gone, the reactions a beat behind. Then came Wanderlei Silva, a wild brawl. Chuck won that one, barely, but it wasn't the same. He was throwing heat and getting hit clean in return. The Iceman looked human. Then came the fight with Sugar Rashad Evans. One right hand, lights out, cold. Chuck fell like a statue collapsing, straight to the canvas, arms sprawled, no twitch, no blink, just gone. That one changed everything. Not just for Chuck, but for Dana White, for fans, for MMA itself. Dana went on record, "He's done. He's my friend. I love him." But that's it. The UFC president, who had built his empire partly on Chuck's back, publicly said it was over. He later admitted, "I gave him a job for life, executive role, just to make sure he stayed retired. I didn't want to see him take any more more punishment. But Chuck didn't want to stop. He took one more fight. UFC 115. Rich Franklin. The first round was competitive until Franklin landed a short right. Chuck went down. Again, knocked out cold. 3 straight knockouts. 4 losses in 5 fights. Each more violent than the last. But the most haunting part wasn't just the losses. It was the way he fell. Head snapping. Eyes rolling. Limbs stiff. These weren't TKO stoppages. They were brain-rattling, lights out, full system shutdowns. Every punch added to the quiet storm building behind Chuck's eyes. And fans started to whisper, "I don't want to watch him fight anymore." After UFC 115, Chuck Liddell announced his retirement. He didn't say he was done because he wanted to. He said it because everyone needed him to. Dana White had pleaded with him. Fans had begged. Doctors had advised. Chuck nodded, smiled, said the right things, but it was clear his heart wasn't in it. Dana gave him a role as UFC Executive Vice President of Business Development, a job that paid well and kept him close to the sport. Chuck wore suits, spoke at press events, made appearances. For a while, it seemed like he had made peace with life outside the cage. But peace doesn't come easy to a man who's been in war. Chuck stayed in shape, kept training. In interviews, he hinted he missed it. He said he still felt good. He still thought about fighting, still watched tapes, still saw openings. That voice in his head, the one that says, "You've still got it, never shut up." Then, in 2016, the UFC was sold to WME-IMG. The new owners made cuts. Chuck was one of them. The job for life Dana promised was gone. Just like that, the paycheck, the purpose, and the connection to the UFC disappeared. And that's when the whispers started again. Chuck began talking about a comeback. Fans were stunned. He was pushing 50, hadn't fought in 8 years. His last 3 fights? Violent knockouts. But Chuck said he felt great. He was training, and he wanted one more dance with his old nemesis, Tito Ortiz. Tito said yes. It didn't matter that they were nearly 100 years old combined. It didn't matter that Chuck hadn't fought in nearly a decade. It didn't matter that every doctor, coach, and fan on earth was begging him not to do it. The fight was booked, under Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy MMA banner. And the moment the first training clip leaked, the mood shifted. Chuck looked slow, rigid. His punches came in slow motion. The footwork was stiff. Even his posture looked off. The fans who once screamed for his fights now pleaded with him, "Please, don't do this." But the Iceman was already marching toward the cage. And no one, not Dana, not his coaches, not even the fans, could stop him. By late 2018, the comeback was no longer a rumor. It was happening. Chuck Liddell was officially returning to fight Tito Ortiz for the 3rd time, nearly a decade after his last bout. He was 48 years old, hadn't fought in over 8 years, and his last 3 performances had all ended the same way, unconscious on the mat. Still, Chuck insisted he was ready. Fans weren't convinced. Golden Boy MMA, Oscar De La Hoya's new venture into combat sports, was the only promotion willing to sanction it. The UFC had no part in it. Dana White, who once promised Chuck a job for life to keep him from fighting, was furious. He told media outlets, "Chuck Liddell is almost 50 years old and has no business fighting anymore. The fact that California sanctioned this fight is disgusting." But California did sanction it. Chuck passed all the required medicals. Andy Foster, head of the Athletic Commission, defended the decision. "Chuck passed everything," he said. "If I had thought it was unsafe, I wouldn't have approved it." On paper, the rematch didn't look as lopsided. Chuck had 2 wins over Tito already. The 3rd, technically, fair game. But fight fans saw the truth long before fight night. When training footage of Liddell surfaced, the tone shifted instantly. The video showed Chuck sparring slowly, missing pads, and shuffling like a man who wasn't just rusty, but deeply compromised. His punches were delayed. His head movement was non-existent. MMA veterans reacted with dread. Fans left comments like, "This isn't nostalgia, this is elder abuse." Even his longtime coach, John Hackelman, refused to train him. He told the media he was heartbroken that Chuck was coming back and wanted nothing to do with it. "I love him too much to watch this," Hackelman said. "He has nothing to prove. He's already a legend." But Chuck wouldn't hear it. He brushed off the criticism at press conferences. He joked that Tito couldn't break an egg, claiming he still had his power. He said he felt better than ever, faster, sharper, smarter. But when he said those words, his speech wasn't crisp. His answers rambled. He stumbled over his own thoughts. Even in promo interviews, fans could see something wasn't right. And yet, the fight sold tickets. The media hyped it. Fans, against their better judgment, tuned in. Not out of excitement, but out of concern, like spectators watching a car inch toward a cliff, hoping someone would hit the brakes. No one did. November 24th, 2018. Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz 3. For some fans, it felt like a reunion. For others, it felt like a funeral. Two men who once defined an era now looked like echoes of themselves. But only one of them had been active. Only one had been fighting in the past decade. And it wasn't Chuck. From the first exchange, the reality was clear. Liddell was stiff. Every movement was a beat behind. His punches were labored, slow, and far from the target. He kept his hands low. His reflexes, once his greatest weapon, were gone. Tito, no longer the brash bad boy, fought cautiously at first, clearly aware of the optics. But after a few minutes, instincts took over. Tito backed Chuck into the cage. He threw a right hand. Chuck's hands weren't there. The punch landed clean. Chuck collapsed to the canvas, again in what would become his final fight. Knocked out cold in the very first round, it wasn't just a loss, it was a full-body shutdown. The crowd didn't cheer. They gasped. Some winced. Commentators were silent for a beat too long. Even Tito looked shaken. Chuck lay there on the mat, face down, arms limp. It was his fourth straight knockout loss, and arguably the most disturbing of all. Because this one didn't come from a young lion. It came from an aging rival who had once never been able to touch him. Now, Chuck couldn't defend himself at all. The backlash was swift. Headlines called it sad, disturbing, and unwatchable. The Guardian labeled it a repugnant spectacle between two men who should have never been sanctioned to fight again. Dana White released a statement condemning the entire event. Anyone who claims to be a friend of Chuck Liddell and let him step into that cage isn't a friend at all, he said. It was disgusting, and the fans agreed. Twitter exploded with grief, not just anger. I grew up watching Chuck. That was hard to watch. Others were more blunt. I hope this wakes people up. That man could die if he fights again. Chuck himself tried to downplay the damage. In a post-fight interview, he said, "I'm fine. I just got caught." But his speech was slurred. He stumbled over words. His eyes looked distant. For a man who had just been violently knocked out again, it didn't sound like recovery. It sounded like denial. Even Tito, victorious at last, showed little joy. His celebration was muted. His post-fight words were almost apologetic. "I wish it didn't have to end like this," he said. Because everyone knew this wasn't a fight. It was a farewell nobody wanted, and everyone feared. No media blitz, no interviews, no thank you tour, just silence. And in that silence, something changed. Fans didn't just stop asking when he'd fight again. They started asking if he was okay at all. In the following months, every time Chuck appeared in public, concerns grew louder. His speech seemed slower. His memory lapses more frequently. On podcasts, he'd sometimes repeat thoughts. He'd forget names. He struggled to follow long questions. Videos circulated online comparing interviews from the early 2000s to now. The difference was stark. Then came the breaking point. In 2021, Chuck was arrested during a domestic incident at his home. While no charges stuck, the aftermath brought something more serious to light. In court filings, Chuck's then-wife alleged that he was showing signs of CTE, the degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. She claimed he had frequent memory issues, struggled with speech, and showed signs of early-onset dementia. "He's been knocked out many times and has CTE," the document read. "He can't remember stuff and gets stuck on speech. He's going to have dementia or Alzheimer's." It was no longer speculation. It was now in writing, in court, from someone who lived with him every day. Experts began weighing in. CTE can't be officially diagnosed until after death, but the symptoms were lining up. Memory problems, paranoia, mood swings, impaired cognition, and Chuck had taken more than enough damage to be at risk. 7 confirmed knockouts, countless training sessions, dozens of wars inside the cage, a full career of trauma that had gone unchecked in an era before fighter health was even discussed. Even fans who once celebrated his iron chin now saw it for what it was, a time bomb. But Chuck never officially addressed the claims. He stayed quiet, occasionally appearing at UFC events or in interviews, but never going deep, never admitting anything was wrong. Still smiling, still pretending, still the Iceman. But the truth was showing, and no one could unsee it. Chuck Liddell wasn't just a retired fighter anymore. He was a symbol of what happens when we cheer a warrior until there's nothing left of him. By the early 2000s and 20s, the conversation around CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, had taken center stage in all contact sports: football, hockey, boxing, and now MMA. And Chuck Liddell was quietly becoming a case study for what it might look like when the damage finally starts showing. CTE is a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated blows to the head. And unlike a broken bone, it doesn't announce itself with a snap. It creeps in, silently, slowly, year by year. Memory loss, mood swings, slurred speech, confusion, depression. It strips away identity until the person looking back in the mirror barely remembers who they used to be. And fans started to notice those signs in Chuck. In podcast interviews, he'd laugh mid-sentence. Not because something was funny, but because he'd lost his train of thought. He'd stutter, restart, lose direction. Hosts would try to gently steer the conversation back, but the damage was already visible. And fans who used to admire his toughness were now haunted by it. One YouTube commenter wrote, "Every knockout I used to cheer for feels like a nail in the coffin now." We didn't realize what we were clapping for. In one particularly uncomfortable moment during a fan Q&A, Chuck was asked to name his top 3 favorite fights. He froze, blinked, then repeated a sentence he'd already said minutes earlier. Fans in the room went quiet. That wasn't the Iceman they remembered. That was someone struggling, right in front of them. And still, Chuck never admitted anything was wrong. He brushed off the concerns as getting older or being out of practice with interviews. He insisted he was fine, but his close circle was shrinking. His marriage had collapsed. His longtime trainers were no longer in the picture, and the UFC had stopped featuring him prominently. Behind the scenes, it seemed like no one knew what to do or say anymore. Meanwhile, doctors and neurologists were beginning to speak up publicly. Though they hadn't examined Chuck directly, many said his behavior matched classic signs of CTE. And since CTE can only be diagnosed post-mortem, the uncertainty added another layer of tragedy. We wouldn't know for sure until it was too late. What made it worse? Chuck wasn't alone. Other MMA pioneers, Gary Goodridge, Spencer Fisher, Mark Kerr, had already confirmed they were battling similar symptoms. Some had memory loss, others had trouble walking. One forgot how to spell his own last name. It was becoming painfully clear that the first wave of MMA legends might also be the first generation to pay the ultimate price for the sport's early ignorance. Chuck Liddell, once the face of violence as entertainment, was now the face of its consequences. When Chuck Liddell's decline became undeniable, many fans turned their attention back to one person, Dana White. For years, Dana had called Chuck a brother. He'd told the press, "I love Chuck. I'd do anything for him." In fact, after Chuck's third straight knockout loss in the UFC, Dana had urged him to retire and gave him a high-paying executive job just to keep him away from fighting again. It was a bold move, and a public one. At the time, it was praised as a rare moment of care in a cutthroat industry. But that didn't last. When Chuck accepted the Tito Ortiz fight under Golden Boy Promotions in 2018, Dana was livid. He called the people around Chuck leeches. He called the fight a disgrace. But he didn't stop it. He didn't step in. He didn't offer him a better option. And when Chuck got knocked out cold in the first round, Dana cut ties completely. No support, no statements, no public check-ins, just silence. Years later, Dana was asked about Chuck in an interview. He shrugged it off. Chuck's a grown man. He made his choice. The quote stung fans. The man who once promised to protect him had walked away, and some saw that as a betrayal. Others blamed themselves. MMA fans were different back in Chuck's prime. We didn't talk about fighter health. We didn't question slurred speech or staggering footwork. We called it toughness. We called it heart. And every time Chuck ate a punch and kept moving forward, we cheered. We posted GIFs. We made highlight reels. But no one asked what came next. Now, years later, fans were watching those same highlights through a different lens. Slower, sadder. One Reddit thread titled, "I feel like we failed Chuck," exploded with comments. "I watched all his knockouts live and never thought about the damage. We begged him to come back, and now look at him." There was even talk of a GoFundMe to support brain research in his name, a sign of how deep the guilt ran. Because Chuck hadn't just given us knockouts, he gave us a decade of memories. He sold out arenas. He built the UFC. He put the sport on his back when no one else could. And now, when he needed help most, the silence around him was deafening.